The lake that's disappearing forever, the true story of Lake Chad. There was once a lake so large, people called it the Mirror of Africa. A lake that fed millions. A lake that carried the songs of fishermen, the cries of cattle, and the laughter of children. But today, that mirror is broken. What used to be 25,000 square kilometers of fresh water has turned into a scattered pool of dust and weeds. Lake Chad, once Africa's sixth largest lake, has lost more than 90% of its water. And with its death, millions of lives are drying away. The lake that fed 4 nations. Lake Chad lies in the heart of Africa, where Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon meet. It's a shared lifeline for 30 million people, mostly farmers, herders, and fishermen. Nearly all its water comes from the Shari and Logwan rivers, flowing from the south into a shallow basin surrounded by desert. Long ago, this region was rich beyond imagination. Ancient empires like Kanem-Bornu rose around these waters, trading ivory, grain, and salt across the Sahara. Villages thrived. Animals roamed freely. In the 19th century, the lake stretched over 28,000 square kilometers, a freshwater jewel in the desert. But something terrible began to happen in the second half of the 20th century. When the sky closed. In the 1960s, the rains began to fade. By the early 1970s, the Sahel was under attack, not from men, but from the sky itself. Drought swept through the region, year after year. The rivers feeding Lake Chad slowed to a trickle. Farmers watched their crops wither. Herders walked their cattle hundreds of kilometers searching for grass. By 1975, the lake had shrunk to just 4,400 square kilometers. By the mid-1980s, it was barely 1,500 square kilometers, less than a tenth of its size in 1960. For the people living here, the drought wasn't just a climate event. It was the start of a slow-motion apocalypse. When water turned into blood. When the lake receded, the shoreline became a battlefield. Farmers wanted land to plant. Herders wanted grass for their animals. Fishermen wanted water to fish. But there was no more to share. At first, they fought with sticks and words. Then, with guns. And from the shadows came new actors, extremist groups, promising power and revenge to the hopeless. Boko Haram and ISWAP began to recruit the poor, the hungry, and the displaced. Villages were raided. Women kidnapped. Markets destroyed. What began as an environmental crisis became a human war zone. 30 million faces of misery. Today, nearly 30 million people depend on Lake Chad's resources, but the lake can no longer sustain them. Over 5 million people need food aid every year. Hundreds of thousands of children are severely malnourished. Fishermen who once caught hundreds of kilograms of fish now haul up empty nets. Farmers who once grew millet, sorghum, and rice now plant in dry sand. Entire villages have migrated, some to cities, some to foreign lands, many to refugee camps. The United Nations calls it one of the worst humanitarian crises on Earth. But it barely makes the headlines. The curse of wealth. There is a strange truth about our planet. There is no conflict without profit. Underneath the soil around Lake Chad lies oil, gas, and minerals, and where there is wealth, there are corporations. The region became a playground for global oil giants. China National Petroleum Corporation, CNPC. ExxonMobil. Glencore. Chevron. Total. Petronas. And NNPC from Nigeria. Their pipelines, rigs, and refineries appeared just as the lake was dying. In 2007, CNPC signed its first big deal with Chad's government. By 2011, oil was flowing through pipelines and refineries near N'Djamena, right when insurgency and displacement were peaking. Coincidence? Perhaps not. Because when instability reigns, local governments get weaker. And when governments get weaker, corporations can dig deeper, with fewer questions asked. The broken promise of development. The people were told that oil wealth would bring jobs, roads, and schools. Instead, it brought corruption, armed guards, and polluted rivers. CNPC was fined for environmental violations. ExxonMobil and Glencore faced protests and disputes. Meanwhile, the lake continued to vanish. Even the so-called Lake Chad Basin Commission formed in 1964 to manage shared water has failed to stop the destruction. Projects worth billions of dollars vanished into bureaucracy, poor planning, and greed. Some proposed grand schemes, like pumping water from the Congo River hundreds of kilometers away to refill Lake Chad. But that dream has remained on paper for decades. Nature's revenge. Now, the climate itself has turned unpredictable. One year brings a burning drought. The next brings floods so violent they wash away entire villages. Hard soils, baked by years of heat, can no longer absorb water. Rain falls, then runs off in torrents, destroying homes and crops. Scientists say climate change has made floods 4 times more likely and 20% more intense in the Lake Chad Basin. It's a cruel paradox, a land dying of thirst, yet drowning in floods. The silent witness, satellites in the sky. Since the 1960s, satellites have silently watched this tragedy unfold. From the old Corona reconnaissance satellites of the Cold War, to NASA's Apollo missions, to modern-day Landsat and MODI's imaging, they have captured the lake's slow death, frame by frame. Scientists can now tell the story of its disappearance with precision. 1963, 26,000 square kilometers. 1975, 4,398 square kilometers. 1984, below 1,500 square kilometers. 2000, a fragile recovery to 5,000 square kilometers. 2025, barely 2,000 square kilometers remain. Each decade, the lake shrinks like a fading heartbeat. The human stories behind the statistics. Aisha, 35, once sold smoked fish by the lakeside. Now, she walks 10 kilometers every day to fetch muddy water for her children. Musa, a young herder, lost half his cattle to drought. He says, "The lake was our mother. Now it's a grave." Fatou, a teacher in a refugee camp, teaches 80 children under a tree. She says most of them have never seen the real lake, only heard stories from their grandparents. For these people, Lake Chad isn't geography. It's memory. And that memory is fading fast. Governments and guns. To protect the region, governments of Chad, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Niger launched military operations against insurgents. But instead of peace, the militarization deepened fear. Villages caught between the army and the rebels suffer most. Thousands were accused of aiding Boko Haram. Thousands more simply disappeared. Insecurity now justifies higher defense budgets, while environmental recovery gets ignored. The result? A region where soldiers guard oil fields, while starving children line up for UN food aid. The lake's final breath. Visual, aerial shot of green patches around dry lakebed, showing the little southern pool still alive. In the 2020s, scientists noticed a small recovery in the southern pool. Seasonal floods brought temporary relief. But the northern pool remains mostly dead, choked by vegetation and sand. Even if the rains return, the water no longer spreads wide. Blocked flows and human mismanagement trap it in fragments. Without massive change, experts say Lake Chad could vanish completely in 20 years. An entire ecosystem, gone. The invisible victims. For most of the world, Lake Chad doesn't exist. It's not a tourist site, not a headline, not a trending topic. But for those living here, it's their whole life, and death. The drying lake has made poverty, hunger, and forced migration the new normal. The youth dream not of fishing or farming, but of leaving. Leaving home, leaving Africa, chasing hope across deserts and seas. The world calls them migrants. But in truth, they are climate refugees, running from a dying lake. Corporate shadows, human costs. Behind the headlines of insurgency and climate change, there lies another invisible story: corporate greed. Oil and gas companies profit while millions go hungry. They dig, they drill, they export. While locals lose the very water beneath their feet. The cycle feeds itself. Conflict justifies more soldiers. Soldiers secure oil zones. Oil brings profit. Profit fuels corruption. And the people, the real owners of the land, remain voiceless. Science versus survival. Researchers across Africa are racing to find solutions. They monitor rainfall, groundwater, and vegetation using satellites and sensors. They build small dams, try solar irrigation, replant reeds, and promote sustainable fishing. But their challenge is monumental. Because science can measure the loss. But only human will can stop it. Lessons from a dying lake. Lake Chad's story isn't unique. Across the world, other lakes are dying too. The Aral Sea in Central Asia. Lake Popo in Bolivia. Lake Ormia in Iran. Each one follows the same pattern. Overuse. Mismanagement. Greed. And then silence. Lake Chad stands as a warning. A mirror reflecting humanity's worst habits. The last prayer of the lake. When the sun sets over Lake Chad, the golden light turns the remaining water into fire. Children still play by the edge. Their laughter echoing across the silence. For them, this lake is not dead yet. It breathes in puddles, in wells, in their memories. There is still hope, if the world listens. Because saving Lake Chad isn't just about saving a body of water. It's about saving millions of human bodies. Their hunger, their dreams, their future. Lake Chad was once called the heart of Africa. Now it's a scar, one visible even from space. But scars tell stories. And this one tells us that environmental collapse, climate change, and corruption are not distant threats. They are happening here, now, to real people. We still have a choice. To restore. To adapt. To protect what remains. Because when a lake dies, a culture dies with it. And when humanity allows that, we lose a part of ourselves. Lake Chad is more than a tragedy. It is a mirror, showing us what we become when profit drowns compassion. And when silence replaces action.